Hi, this is Victoria Nalule, and here with me is Mr. Stephen Dow, a senior lecturer at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. Today we're going to have four topics. We're going to discuss four topics. The first one will be concentrating on gas contracts. The second one, we shall talk about liberalization in the energy sector. The third one, we'll discuss more on renewables. And then the last one, we shall talk about project finance. Before we start, I'd like Mr. Stephen Dow to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Stephen Dow. I am Senior Lecturer in Energy Law at the Centre for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. I've done this job for just over 20 years. I started very young, I'm not that old. Since then I have taught a very large number of students. I have taught all around the world. I've taught state companies, I've taught commercial companies. I've advised governments, hopefully sometimes even got the advice right. And I have look forward to doing that for a while still to come.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm one of his former students. So yes, you definitely need to hear from Stephen Dow. So the first discussion, we want to focus on gas contracts. What are the main features of a long-term gas contract?
What we have to remember about gas contracts is that they are very long-term ideas, so they have to be their own set of rules. Fundamentally what it does is it takes a very large quantity of gas and exchanges it for a very large sum of money over a very long period of time. And all the contract needs to do is start with that gas and the money and swap them over, say, 20, 25 years. But there is no need for the gas to go that way at the same rate as the money goes this way. So what the contract does is control the dislocation between the flow of gas and the flow of money. And it really is that simple. Except the mechanics to do that become incredibly complicated, because what you can't do in a gas contract is regard the rest of the world as important. It doesn't matter at all. The gas contract is between the buyer and the seller, and the rest of the world doesn't matter. So what has to happen is, if there's a problem in between the buyer and the seller, we can't stop. We can't do what the law normally does and simply says, let's resolve from this contract, let's sue each other for damages. If one party breaches, if one party has a problem, you have to say, that doesn't matter, we'll keep going. We'll simply compensate for misperformance at a later date. Again, the mechanics of that become more complicated, but the basic idea is we don't give up, we don't stop. We simply keep going until we reach the end of the life of the gas contract. All the gas is with the buyer and all the money is with the seller. Okay. To do this, we have to have various mechanisms inside the gas contract. We have to make sure that the buyer takes gas when they actually want it, so there has to be a nomination process. So the buyer says, this is the amount of gas I want. The buyer doesn't say, give me a proportionate share of the gas. They say, give me the gas that I actually want today. So there's a nomination process to do that. If the nomination then arrives at the wrong amount, the buyer asks for 100 units, the seller only gives him 80, then you wouldn't say, well, you can keep your 80 units and I'll sue you for 100. You take the 80 units and you sue, well, you compensate for the other 20. And you simply have compensation in the future for those 20 units. The seller is in default, therefore you would expect the next gas, tomorrow's gas, to be slightly cheaper, so you get the 20 units slightly cheaper in the future. And similarly, if the buyer is at fault, then the seller simply gets more money, gets a premium for future gas. And in this way, we can start to say we've actually dislocated the flow of money from the flow of the gas. We also make sure in a gas contract that the actual amount of the actual value is paid. And remember, in a gas contract, what's really valuable is the availability of gas, not the actual physical commodity. So what the buyer will do is take or pay. And the buyer simply says, it is valuable to me to get that gas. Eventually, I will pay for it even if I don't take it.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, Mr. Stephen Dow. So our next question is actually dedicated to lawyers who were involved in negotiating these contracts. What should lawyers and policymakers put into consideration while negotiating long-term gas contracts?
The first thing you always remember about gas is that gas actually is important as a commodity. Okay. When we talk about oil, we're usually really talking about money. We just happen to have it in the form of oil. In the case of gas, we're usually actually wanting the gas itself. And so the first thing you have to remember is to try and get the gas out of the ground and to your local consumers, we're assuming this is not crossing a border at this moment, to your local consumers as cheaply as possible. You don't want to build rent into the system because all that does is make gas more expensive for local consumers, and since it's local gas, you really want it to get to those consumers as cheaply as possible. So first things first, make sure there's no rent in the system. You have a regulation to make sure there's no excess costs. Okay. The next thing you want to make sure of is that you actually deal with the volume you have. There are two ways to sell gas. You can sell gas all of a field, or you can sell a given volume of gas. Person who buys all of a field, a so-called depletion contract, in history they were very common. They're a lot less common now, simply because as gas markets get more competitive, they're difficult to run. But if you're buying a fixed volume of gas, a supply contract, then what you're doing is having many different buyers from that same field. And so you have to make sure that all the gas gets to buyers. Then you have to make sure that you've got the infrastructure to cope with it. And do you have the pipes the right size? And that often is a question of timing, because what you have to remember for the policymakers and the negotiators side is we're rarely dealing with one contract. We're dealing with one contract at a time, but it is in the context of lots of contracts. Markets are made up of lots of contracts. You don't look at that individual contract and say that contract is a market. The market is all of those contracts operating together. That then means, because all these contracts are operating together, we have the opportunity to substitute gas in between those contracts. We can make the flow of gas whatever we want, and then we can reallocate what happened in the past. So that we make sure the right person had the gas. As long as the people who want gas get gas and burn it, we can always go back and simply say, whose gas was it? And the more contracts and the more opportunity for substitution that we have, and the more functionality in our market, the easier that becomes.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen Dow. That marks the end of our first video on long-term gas contracts.